Good morning, intuitives. Um, you know, no video in a couple days. I've had a couple ideas running around my head and stuff going on, but here we are late Sunday afternoon and I'm being lazy, and one of the ideas I had just clicked while I was listening to some music. I want to thank everybody who's new to the channel. Thank you for taking the time and subscribing. If you watch my subscriber count, I have this weird phenomenon. It seems that for every 2 subscribers I get, I lose one. So I guess, you know, my delightful quirkiness gets old quick to some people, or I say something that they don't agree with because it probably hits home in a bad way, as in they did something like that to somebody and they bail out of here, which is fine. But I just find that a very, very unique pattern I have, and being an INFJ, I notice patterns. So what I wanted to talk about in this video is the fury of a scorned INFJ and how an INFJ will eventually expose you. Now, this is different from INFJ rage, where you're in that kind of situation where you have to respond in that moment. This is more along the lines of, you've been wronged, you've been exploited, you've been abused, and there's not really anything you can do about it at the time, but later you will get into a position where you can expose that person for who they really are. And, it's interesting, as I do in most videos for the INFJ stuff, I use, famous INFJ celebrities as examples. I use well-known fictional INFJs as well, along with my own stories, to give examples that people are familiar with, that they've probably seen, and then they can see the points I'm trying to make. And that's going to be in this case as well, because talking about scorned INFJs, I have, for an example, an INFJ celebrity whom I've been a fan of since the mid-90s. She's a well-known singer-songwriter. You know who it is because you can see the thumbnail. It's Alanis Morissette. And in her case, I can use her in two things she spoke out about INFJ, scorned INFJ fury. I can use two of her famous songs to make my point in two different ways. And Alanis is just a very talented singer-songwriter, and seems to be a pretty cool person. I don't really know that much about her. I've seen her in a few documentaries years ago. I never really ever gave much thought about, like, oh, I'd like to see these two celebrities together, but the only exception to that was like 20 years ago in the early 2000s. I really wanted to see Keanu Reeves and Alanis Morissette together. Now I know they're both INFJs, so hey, it could have worked maybe. So, you know, using Alanis Morissette as an example, in her two, I'm going to talk about two of her songs and what those songs talk about, and how, since she wrote them and she's an INFJ, the points I'm trying to make. And I'm going to talk about a scorned INFJ in a relationship, and this is a really good example because I'm talking about her breakout hit, You Ought to Know, and it's about that weird dude from Full House. So that in itself is an example of how I said, older narcissistic men will target younger women for relationships, and a lot of times they're INFJ, even more so they're ENFJ, but it's one of those scenarios where the younger woman in the relationship thinks that they're in a committed relationship, and they're like, oh, this guy's older, he's, quote, had his fun, he's ready to settle down, because the woman in these relationships is not like the casual dating kind of girl. But the guy, most of the time, is just like, hey, young thing, casual fun, have my fun and then kick her to the curb on to the next one because I'm the shit. And it's, their privilege for being with a guy like me. And you see famous examples of that. I can think of a few others over the years that I'm not going to get into. But, that's a perfect example. Her song, I mean, you've all heard the saying, no fury like a woman scorned. No fury like an INFJ scorned, perhaps more so with a female. But you talk about a great, like, angry breakup song, just calling somebody out for being a scumbag. You can't do much better than that song. I mean, I love her her raw emotion in that. Like, you listen to it, you can feel her INFJ rage. Like, she's just laying it all out there. And that's what an INFJ does. See, INFJs can see through people's weaknesses. We see their motivations, their dark sides, and their, quote, secrets that they don't want others to see. We watch carefully at how people treat others, of different backgrounds, age, gender, and we start to establish who that person really is, and if there's any consistency between them, or if it's all just an act, if they're just a yes man, or trying to be Mr. Cool, or trying to act like Mr. Big Shot all the time. We put all that together. And we have that knowledge, stored, and given our abilities to put pieces of puzzles together, we, over time, develop a picture of who this person really is. Okay. So, in a situation like she sings about in her infamous song, she was able to realize, who that guy really was, and that she wasn't in the kind of relationship that she thought she was in, and luckily for her, I mean, unluckily, she basically, if you listen to the song, came to the conclusion that she was being played. But then she decided to record that song, put it all out there, and now that dude is forever tied to that song. That was her breakout song. So not only did it make her famous, make her like a well-known singer, it forever will call that guy out, and that's kind of something like an INFJ will do. They If you wrong an INFJ, they want the whole world to know who you really are, because it's not just about like, we're going to call you out. That's what we do. It's, I'm going to call you out to make sure everybody knows who and what you are, so that no one else will be in the position that I was in. I can speak to that point myself. I'm trying to do the same thing in the fire service. So when anybody crosses an INFJ, certain things can happen. If it's not too over the line. The most common would be a door slam. What I'm trying to say, not every way an INFJ is crossed warrants being called out, but sometimes it does. And an INFJ, being empathic and truly caring about other people, we want abusers to be exposed. We're not the keep quiet type that'll just let that pattern continuing. That'll eat at us. The idea of, if I don't call this person out, there's going to be others treated just like me, and I can't handle that. So that weighs on us as well, and gives us the courage to speak out. INFJs and ENFJs too, we a lot of the times are the first people to speak out about abuses that are, patterns of behavior, things that are written off as just what you signed up for, or rites of passage in certain professions. It'll usually be an INFJ or an ENFJ who first speaks up and says, enough's enough, and then the floodgates open. And that brings me to my second point with Alanis Morissette, another infamous song of hers, which really for its time was brave as shit when you think about it. Like, you look at the song's Hands Clean, where she talks about how her manager abused, and had statutory rape against her when she was only in her mid-teens and he was like 30, and basically played the old, you want to be a star, this is, you have to stay quiet, this is paying your dues kind of thing. And fortunately, though it's long overdue, a lot of women are getting the courage to speak out and say those kinds of stories, about people like Harvey Weinstein and far too many others that are not facing justice. But Alanis made that song in the early 2000s, I believe 2002. So for that time, you think about just how badass that was. There wasn't the movement that there is now. She was just laying it all out there. And I guess she felt, that the time was right. She was in a place in her career where she wouldn't face retaliation, or just couldn't take it anymore and wanted to tell the story. But, if you listen to her play that song live, you can feel her emotion and her pain in it. But I think she's reached the point where, like, she knows she was a victim. She isn't ashamed of what happened to her. Her being an INFJ, I assume she probably played in her head, hundreds, thousands of times over what she could have done differently in that situation. But, luckily was able to tell her story through, a very good song. And now that guy who abused and raped her is now forever tied to that. That is his legacy. That is what he will be forever remembered for. He is the guy who abused Alanis Morissette when she was it was like 14 or 15 and he was 30. That's all everybody's ever going to remember about him. And I'm sure when, she told her story, she made damn sure that there won't be any other victims like her with this. I think he was a producer. It was something in the music industry before, or manager, something before she was well known. So, you think of, if you listen to that song, it's incredibly brave how she tells that story. And, just talks about how she just basically wants the truth out there. The lyrics that stick out in my head is the one where she says, "What part of our history's been reinvented and under rugs swept?" She's pulling that dirt out from under the rug and letting everybody know what he did, even though I'm sure, she's, I guess I would say, like, a little embarrassed for it. Like, and that's might not be the right word, but anybody who's been abused, you have that weird feeling of like, what could I have done differently to have that not happened? And you obviously don't think about that in the time. And I want to tie in a little witchcraft too, since I opened the Pandora's box on that. Abusers, I will say this, sometimes it takes years for us to speak out. Sometimes the timing's never right. In the moment, you fear retaliation, you fear your career being ruined. It may be years before you're able to speak out against what was done to you. Not everything warrants INFJ rage in the moment, take a swing at them, or like, Daenerys Targaryen style rant. That's not always the appropriate answer, and that's not always possible at the time. But, little witchcraft tie. I'm sure most people there are familiar with the tarot, how it's used, as a divination tool. Gives you a little guidance into what the future holds, well, past and present too. And it'll get its own video, but there are bad cards within the tarot. There are cards you don't want in your reading. There are cards that, you would like to see in certain other people's reading, and one of them is this. This is the Seven of Swords. If you look at the card, you can see, there's a guy with 5 swords in his hand, tiptoeing off, thinking he got away with it, looking over his shoulder. That's the card of the abuser. That's the card of somebody who uses somebody or exploits them, takes advantage of them, breaks their boundaries, puts them in a position where they think they can't say no. And they think they're getting away with it, because they're a big shot, because of who they are. But, if you notice again, they didn't get all the swords, did they? There's still 2 swords there. Well, eventually, those 2 swords will come for him. It may take time, but eventually they always do. And that, is just a good little witchcraft tie into, Alanis Morissette's story with the song Hands Clean. And it's funny, like with her, she's been one of my favorite singer-songwriters since the mid-90s, and I always like related to her music more than any other like female singer singing from a female point of view, and I never understood it. And then now I did, in the past couple years, because I'm like, oh, she's an INFJ. Especially like my personal, just, my little personal anecdote is I really like her, the song Head Over Feet. I'd be like, man, this would be a good song for like a girl to sing to a guy that she's in love with, and the guy may be questioning himself. And also now, the reason why I specifically like that song, like, like a girl singing that to me, would be if you listen to the lyrics of it and what she says about whomever this guy is. To me, it certainly sounds like the guy she's singing to is an INFJ. And I vaguely remember a documentary from like 2005. I guess it was like for the 10-year anniversary of Jagged Little Pill, where she basically met a guy and didn't think guys like that, actually existed. It makes sense if he was an INFJ male, because there's just not that many of us out there. So, her stories, her music are good examples of why you never scorn an INFJ, because eventually, whether right away or years later, the INFJ will expose you for who they are, and that'll often inspire others to speak out against maybe that specific person or people who committed the same actions against people. And she's just a good example of why, as INFJs, we have to be leaders in speaking out and exposing people for who they really are. It's part of our integrity, it's part of our identity. It gives us purpose to help others, so it's just something really important to do. Oh, I also found it interesting. I was looking a little bit up about her to make this video. She does a really great cover of the Police song King of Pain, which I said in many videos ago. To me, that's like the official anthem for INFJs, as Sting, an INFJ himself, wrote it. And it's interesting that, another famous INFJ singer-songwriter also is really drawn to that song. Like, it speaks to her. I would assume as an INFJ, whether she knows that or not. And she also just does a great cover of it. I think you should all go listen to that too, both versions, the Police and Alanis Morissette's version. She says Queen of Pain instead of King of Pain, but, if you're a female, you might like that better, or might just be easier to relate to. I would love very much if her and Sting would do a duet of that song one day. That would be completely badass, but I suppose only time will tell. Just remember, as INFJs, you know, your integrity's not for sale, and if you are abused and you don't speak up right away, it does not mean your integrity's damaged. It's not if you were abused, it's not your fault. You know, you are not tainted, you are not damaged. In a way, yes, you do kind of have a duty to speak out for the betterment of others so that nobody else goes through what you went through. It may take time for you to get to that place of courage where you're able to do that, though. Just understand, too, it's never too late to speak up, though. If something happened to you, if you were abused in some way, you can call that abuser out years later if you want. You should. It's never too late to tell the truth. Just remember that. Trust your intuition for when you feel it's the right time to speak out, and never sell out your integrity, no matter how rich or famous somebody's promising to make you.